Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown, as well as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of the Center, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this 2023 Berkeley Center lecture with Pankaj Mishra on the topic, What the Global South Can Teach Us. Pankaj, thanks so much for being here with us this afternoon, for being back here at Georgetown. We're really looking forward to your talk. The Berkeley Center lectures go back to the creation of the Berkeley Center in 2006, then as part of a university-wide effort to promote intercultural and interreligious understanding by addressing critical issues at the intersection of ethics, religion, peace, and world affairs. The lecture series has included leading global thinkers, for example, Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, and Martha Nussbaum, intellectuals fully engaged with the issues of the day. The issues of the day. There's no shortage of issues of the day these days. Several years ago, you'll recall the term poly crisis started to appear in print and even in conversations, coined aptly, I think, to describe the multiple and overlapping economic, environmental, political, social, and security crises the world is facing. Today, maybe you'll agree, those crises feel more acute than ever. The Israel-Hamas war, just 1 month old, has already generated untold human suffering, on top of the Russian war against Ukraine, the civil war in Sudan, and other violent conflicts around the world. And the threats are proliferating in non-security areas as well. Later this month, as we know, COP28 will convene as part of the ongoing and so far inadequate effort to address the global climate change crisis. Meanwhile, closer to home, the United States is hurtling toward a monumental and contentious presidential election just 1 year away. Our internal divisions, our inability to bridge our political divides, are undermining our capacity to cooperate externally to address the global challenges of our time. Challenges of war and peace and climate, but also of economic and social equality and opportunity amid the ongoing cultural and technological transformations around us. So today, more than ever, we need to find creative ways to broaden our debates and generate new, constructive approaches to the diverse, complex challenges facing global humanity, to develop what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, marked by inclusive conversations that respect and acknowledge difference while seeking common ground in a divided world. And we're here in Washington, D.C., so I would add that in our new emergent multipolar reality, we in the United States in particular, need to learn to listen to and engage with diverse voices around the world in new ways, not to agree or even aspire to reach full consensus, that's impossible, but to identify shared interests and move forward together. It's against this backdrop, Pankaj, that we're looking forward to your presentation and our conversation around the theme, What the Global South Can Teach Us. There's really no one better positioned to challenge us to broaden and deepen the global conversation at this critical moment. So it's great to welcome you back to Georgetown. And now it's my honor to introduce you in as succinct a fashion as I can. Pankaj Mishra is known to so many of us here as a renowned Indian author and essayist who for more than 3 decades has shared his wide-ranging insights in powerful articles and prize-winning books, both fiction and nonfiction. Pankaj first contributed literary essays and reviews to leading Indian periodicals. His first book, Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, Travels in Small-Town India, 1995, was a travel log which described the cultural and social changes in India at that moment in globalization. Growing international recognition followed the publication of his first novel, The Romantics, in the year 2000, a novel which won the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. 2 of his subsequent nonfiction books, An End to Suffering, The Buddha and the World, 2004, and Temptations of the West, How to Be Modern in India, Pakistan, and Beyond, were featured in the New York Times 100 Best Books of the Year. Now, like many of you here, I was first introduced to Pankaj's work through his magisterial book, From the Ruins of Empire, The Intellectuals Who Remade Asia, published in 2012. It was, among other accolades, the first work by a non-Western writer to win Germany's prestigious Leipzig Book Award. Like his best-selling book familiar to many of us, Age of Anger, A History of the Present, from 2017, From the Ruins of Empire explores the enduring legacies of colonialism for our contemporary global era, a theme related to today's talk. And just last year, Pankaj published another critically acclaimed novel, Run and Hide, which is also set in contemporary India. Alongside this impressive literary production, Pankaj has established himself as one of the world's preeminent essayists, writing across a wide range of cultural, historical, and political topics, and appearing in many leading outlets, including The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and The London Review of Books, among many others. Some of his most incisive essays are included in his 2020 edited collection, which I highly recommend, with its provocative title, Bland Fanatics, Liberals, the West, and Afterlives of Empire. Pankaj is a member of the UK's Royal Society of Literature and has received a great number of fellowships and awards. I'll just mention Yale University's Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize. Pankaj, we're really delighted to have you with us this afternoon. After your remarks, you and I will engage in a conversation here on stage, leaving plenty of time to respond to questions from the audience. You'll see, as you came in and on your seats, there are index cards. We'd ask you, when a great question occurs to you, that you can formulate on one side of an index card in legible fashion. Please write it down and just send it to the outside ends of the aisles. We'll pick those up, and I think this will be an efficient way to get through as many questions as possible before we close. So thanks again for being here, and please join me in welcoming Pankaj Mishra to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for your incredibly generous introduction. And thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be back, and I have to thank Tom again for putting me in such distinguished company. And actually, I realize more and more a very intellectually congenial company that I find myself here. I should apologize. I mean, I realized after I'd sent the title of the talk to you that it may sound a little bit presumptuous what the Global South can teach us. I mean, partly because the Global South refers to a very large part of the world's population. And also, I personally know only a fraction of the many political and intellectual traditions that exist in this Global South. But I was actually quite intrigued by how the phrase, the Global South, I'm sure a lot of you would remember that this phrase has been in circulation only for the last couple of years or so. There were other ways to think about non-Western countries. There was the expression third world, there was the expression post-colonial, but suddenly now, everyone is talking about the Global South, and you realize that actually the phrase is being used, has been used a great deal since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and it was used largely instrumentally. There was a lot of anxiety amongst foreign policy circles in the West that countries like South Africa or India, China definitely, Brazil, were not supporting the Western effort against Russia. So how do we persuade the Global South to join this alliance against Russia, and also China, with which we are engaged in a new Cold War? I mean, I think this very quick infatuation with the Global South is, we can conclude, more or less dead. I think it died in the last month or so. after October 7, it really became, I think, very, very clear that we are in an incredibly polarized global environment today, and we need to definitely develop a more sophisticated understanding of the experiences of many people in the so-called global south. And today, I mean, I'd really like to outline one likely trajectory for this reckoning with the global south, something that I hope moves away from this very intellectually barren realpolitik conception of the global south. I think the necessity of it, of course, Tom mentioned some of this. The necessity for this seems very clear because, I think the great economic and political power of Western countries is finally being rebalanced, and it's leading to an assertiveness among countries that were once ruled or dominated by Western powers. In one sense, this has been overdue for a very long time, especially the economic side of things. I think as early as 1931, Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi was writing to Western readers and saying, look, this power you have depends entirely on your capacity to exploit foreign markets, on foreign markets being open to you in the absence of international competitors. And once Asian and African countries start becoming more competitive, that power would start to decline. And I think, it's very clear today that so many things that are happening within, let's say, the United States, whether it's outsourcing of jobs, extreme inequality, or the white supremacist upsurge, you cannot explain these things without reference to the rise of China as a manufacturing giant and also as an aggressively nationalist world power. And I think that's the other place where things are changing very fast, is that Western powers are confronting new modes of not only, political economy or how to organize society, civil society, but also different forms of intellectual creation in the countries of Asia and Africa, especially the production of different histories, different outlooks that depart very radically from dominant Western assumptions. And I think we can see this very, very clearly in the response from outside the Western world to the violence in the Middle East today. So I think all of this makes imperative, at the very least, a global perspective, and not just a perspective that looks at the histories of India, China, or South Africa separately and then adds them to the history of the West, but really kind of, by a global perspective, I mean really dismantling, abandoning the whole structure of preconceptions on which a West-centric view has long been based. This is very difficult, obviously, because I think these modes of thought and perception developed largely during the Cold War, when Western politicians, commentators were battling against an indictment of Western-style democracy and capitalism by communists and communist sympathizers around the world. I think one consequence of this intense ideological clash was that people who were opposed to communism consistently overestimated the so-called free world. They saw in it more widespread and enduring material, moral, and intellectual uplift than could be supported by historical facts. I mean, I remember when in the late 90s, I started publishing in Europe and America, writers and journalists would commonly present their countries as spiritual and intellectual heirs of Greek democracy, Renaissance, individualism, Enlightenment, rationality, all the good things in the past they were laying claim to. And these were kind of mythologies of virtue. And they went with a kind of obsession with the crimes of the various enemies of the enlightened West, people like Stalin or Mao Zedong or Hitler. And of course, we now know that they managed to obscure the long centuries of global violence and dispossession that made Britain and the United States in particular so uniquely powerful and wealthy. The other problem with this Cold War internationalism or liberalism was that it amounted in practice to a kind of reflexive contempt for other worldviews, for other traditions. And in the end, I think it created a regime of intellectual inequality, something that is less noticed or theorized, written about than social inequality or economic inequality. But I do think this intellectual inequality is devastatingly effective in closing off avenues of thought and imagination. I mean, for instance, how little do we know of the non-Western writers and activists, some of whom I wrote about in From the Ruins of Empire that Tom mentioned, like people like Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Jose Marti, Rabindranath Tagore, Sun Yat-sen, who offered both a very sort of strong critique of Western political and economic arrangements, and also offered alternative visions of human coexistence. So, in that sense, even if larger imbalances of socio-economic power are now being addressed, there are still some staggering imbalances of intellectual life. I think, a newspaper columnist, and I've been one in India or in China or Ghana or Egypt, is unlikely to ever be in a position to publish anything unless he or she knows some basic things about European or American political and intellectual traditions. I find it extraordinary that most Western scholars, let alone newspaper reporters or columnists at the New York Times or Washington Post, do not have a deep acquaintance with any major Indian, Chinese, African, or Arab history and thought. I think we're beginning to learn more about people like the 3rd century BC Emperor Ashoka, who renounced empire building and attempted a new form of governance based on the Buddhist principles of compassion and tolerance. But this knowledge is, again, very, very confined. I mean, these political experiments, these moral experiments, even the left tradition, which is supposedly internationalist and cosmopolitan, it continues to invoke Marx, Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt. It doesn't quite escape this trap of insularity. So this intellectual archive in Western countries that has been really created out of this experience of the 19th century, of course, and 2 world wars, the crises of the 1920s and 30s, the Holocaust, of course. This archive remains dominant. It's routinely prioritized over the insights of people elsewhere. People, let's not forget, who were exposed very early on to fundamentally violent and unstable political and economic systems. And a figure like Gandhi, for instance, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more, had a much broader exposure in the world, in 3 different continents, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, much more so than, say, the Frankfurt School theorists. When Gandhi wrote about the mass deceptions and hidden violence of Western democracies, he was, obviously not an intellectual, not a trained intellectual, but he had this experience of direct exposure to some of the realities that existed in the sort of Asian and African colonies of European empires. Hannah Arendt hadn't really started writing about British concentration camps in South Africa as a kind of precursor to the monstrous 20th century crimes against Jewish people that we saw in the 20th century. And people like Gandhi or Nehru, for instance, in India, they were already talking about how fascism, European fascism, is really the twin brother of Western imperialism. There's so many examples. The Indian poet Tagore, who I just mentioned, he wrote some of the sharpest critiques of competitive nationalisms, both of Japan as well as the United States, in the 1910s and 20s, when most of his peers, most people like Thomas Mann, many other German, French, Italian writers were still going on about the glories of their great civilizations and their great nations. Tagore could see very clearly how European chauvinisms were complicit, some of the most monstrous wars and crimes ever witnessed in history against ethnic minorities. This was not just diagnosis. He tried to come up with some sort of a response to this, some sort of an alternative to this, a kind of rooted cosmopolitanism, an ethic that was opposed to that of nationalism, something that he embodied in various institutions, including this famous university at Santiniketan, where some of India's most impressive thinkers and artists were educated, including Amartya Sen. We can find similar efforts, grassroots movements in early Republican China in early 20th century. We can also see in the writings of Liang Qichao, another figure I wrote about in From the Ruins of Empire, one of the foremost Chinese intellectual who personally witnessed the First World War in Europe, and whose critique of the social order, the existing social order in Europe, anticipates some of the critiques that we see in Simone Weil and Jacques Maritain. There is, I think, many writers, many thinkers traveling through Europe or sort of encountering European political and economic systems were very clear about how this particular society that the West had created, a society consisting of rational individuals interacting in the marketplace, overseen by a night watchman state. This society was potentially a recipe for conflict and disorder. And not only that, as I said, they were also really coming up with new conceptions of social interdependence, individual agency, and cosmopolitan responsibility. And they knew that these were needed to save the world from the temptations of libertarianism or the temptations of authoritarianism, which are very, very apparent today. And it's not, again, I should say this is not because they were kind of, geniuses predisposed to be great visionaries. It's just that they had been forced to assess modern political and economic systems very clearly, and from the vantage point of their Asian and African settings. Yet, only a small part of their analyses, which are extremely relevant today, have made it to the Western mainstream. You have a few figures here and there, like Frantz Fanon. His theories of decolonization have entered journal circulation. They are taught at universities. I think it's largely because his main work was introduced by Jean-Paul Sartre to Western readers. There is actually so much more of the actual experience of decolonization that has yet to be assessed, let alone made relevant to this moment of the poly crisis. What was this experience? It was this experience of catching up. The experience of post-colonial countries really consisted of trying to catch up with the people who had either pushed them behind during the long decades of colonialism, or had simply without reference to them, sort of forged ahead in every realm. The first leaders of Asia and Africa, whether it's Nehru or Nasser in Egypt, or Nkrumah, or Mao, or Sukarno in Indonesia. It was catch up with the West. Even today, I mean, I think ruling classes in places like India not interested in, left-wing theory or revolution. They're rather more interested in McKinsey rather than Marx, but they've not really dared to alter the founding basis of their legitimacy as modernizers, who are going to lead their countries to convergence with the West and attainment of European and American living standards. I mean, this is, Nehru used to talk about this in a different way. Today, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi talks about it in a much more grandiose fashion, but it's about catching up with the West and becoming a major world power along the Western model. Obviously, there were always very serious questions about whether these freshly imagined communities, national communities of Asia and Africa, were innately strong and cohesive enough to withhold the strains and divisions of state building, of economic modernization. It was very likely that on their journey to becoming, modernity in this whole process of catching up with the West, they were likely to be contemptuous of their own ethnic and religious diversity, and of course, older ways of life, more traditional ways of life. But nevertheless, there was that commitment that we just have to really catch up with our former Western overlords. And, it's also true that if you look at it from the perspective of, someone in China or India, it really did seem that Europeans or Americans had mustered up an unprecedented collective power through new forms of organization, like industrialized economy or a political institution like the nation state. And in recent decades, especially I think since the end of the Cold War and end of the last challenge to Western power, which was Soviet communism, I think many people here have started to see convergence on the Western model of endless economic growth and mass consumption as the only way forward for non-Western countries. And I think at least for 2.5 decades now, mainstream commentators in United States and Western Europe have assumed that this convergence is happening under their benign supervision. As late as 2008, there's a book titled The Post-American World, very, very influential book at the time with Fareed Zakaria. He actually wrote the rise of the West is a consequence of American ideas and actions. And the world is going America's way. And countries are becoming more open, more democratic, more market-friendly. In one sense, these kinds of simple-minded ideas and assumptions are still shaping the speeches of many politicians, think tank reports, or newspaper editorials, and of course, supplying endless material to TV pundits and columnists. But I think it's also true that one event after another since the financial crisis of 2008 has really very cruelly exposed such facile narratives. China, it may look very market-friendly. Some may have doubts about even that, but it looks very far away from Western democracy. The experiment with free market capitalism in Russia, we know how that turned out. It entrenched a kleptocratic regime with a messianic belief in Russian supremacism. Even in India, you see authoritarian leaders, anti-democratic backlashes, right-wing extremism. So, you see large parts of the non-West replicating the violence and trauma suffered by Europe in the early 20th century on an potentially much larger scale, inflicting during this process the profoundest damage ever inflicted on the environment. You can see it in rising sea levels, erratic rainfall, in places like India, drought, declining harvests, devastating floods. This is all happening, and the actual prospect of catching up with the West is receding. I speak of this, I bring this up because this whole fraught experience of these countries of, post-colonial, the whole post-colonial era, this experience of failed or thwarted modernization and state building, this experience of secessionist movements, ethnic religious insurgencies, right-wing demagogues, despotism, in what sense the experiences that we are now exposed to, even in the heart of the modern West, this experience in the global South provoked even deeper engagement with the eternal problems of politics and society. I talked about people like Liang Checha or Tagore. That was a different generation, but I think if you look at people, the intelligentsia that emerged from the global South in post 1945, whether it's the Egyptian economist Samir Amin or the Indian social psychologist Ashish Nandi, the Malaysian sociologist Syed Hussein Alatas, so many examples, the Colombian scholar Arturo Escobar, all sort of exemplary in their overturning of assumptions derived from a particular mode of thinking about things, and particularly assumptions derived from the histories of the West. But there's also been another kind of intellectual, political, and moral tradition in some of these countries, another kind of thinker, an activist. And I will take as my example, I think the most famous of them all, you will all know his name, which is Gandhi. And he was really, in that sense, different from even his peers, his intellectual and political companions, because they were in several parts of Asia during the resistance to Western rule or Western domination amongst Hindu groups in India, or you had Shinto sectarians in Japan, or the anti-Christian boxers in China, or Buddhists in Sri Lanka. They were always intellectuals and leaders who were, in one sense, making political ideologies of nationalism out of religious traditions. This process went on in many, many different countries, people looking at Islam or Buddhism and kind of forging some kind of a nationalist political ideology. And Gandhi, although he was personally very religious, was actually very strongly opposed to this kind of invention of tradition. Many of his own peers were Hindu nationalists. In fact, one of them was eventually the person who inspired his assassin. All these peers were determined to unite Hindu around a kind of hyper-masculinist Hinduism. And Gandhi saw very clearly, these nationalists would merely replace one set of rulers in India with another, with the same kind of methods, with the same kind of worldview, as he put it, English rule without the Englishman. In fact, I think the reason why it's really difficult to see as a, kind of intellectual or thinker is because he actually did not embrace any of the ideologies of collective redemption, whether it's capitalism or socialism or nationalism or industrialism or scientism. He just refused to endorse each one of these worldviews. In fact, he refused to endorse even Gandhianism. He said, if there is such a thing as Gandhianism, you should destroy it immediately. Because it's, and it's really interesting to think about why he would do all this, because he was convinced that the idea of conviction, the idea of truth, which all these ideologies make claim on, we have to have a much more complex idea of this. So his whole idea of, satyagraha, which literally translates as holding fast to truth, the idea behind it was to always keep an open mind and be ever ready to find out that what we believed to be truth was after all untruth. There was a kind of basic recognition, because he grew up in an incredibly diverse society like India's, that societies with diverse populations will come to inhabit, willy-nilly, what we now call the post-truth age. As he said, we will never think alike, all of us, and we shall always see truth in fragments and from different angles of vision. This is just one example of how different his thinking was on a whole range of issues. He had no interest, for instance, in rights. So much of our political language is about rights and social rights, human rights. In fact, there was a time in 1947 the Director General of UNESCO wrote to him and said, would you like to say something about human rights, because we are putting out some kind of a document on this. And he said, look, I can't do this because I've learned from my illiterate but extremely wise mother that all rights that we deserve come from duty well done. The very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship of the world. So, again, departing from the whole language of rights and emphasizing needs, duties, obligations as a basis of a good society. And the other reason, I think the most important one, is the reason why we don't think of him as an intellectual is because he spoke of not progress, but of moral transformation, of moral persuasion. He spoke of sacrifice. He, is actually his own assassin. When he was asked in court, why did you kill him? He actually said, this man, he's completely irrational. He keeps talking about really backward, superstitious things like power of the soul, the inner voice. He talks about fasting. He talks about prayer and the purity of the mind. So I think, it's easy to sort of miss the uniqueness of him if one thinks of him, as this religious figure that this assassin made him out to be, or as a very devout Hindu, and he also wore a loincloth, in order to affirm his solidarity with Indian peasants. But the fact is that Gandhi was also a very devoted reader of the Bible. Actually, Pope John Paul II once said that he was much more of a Christian than many other people who say they are Christians. This is a man who counted Emerson, Thoreau as his gurus. He read the gay socialist writer, British writer, Edward Carpenter, someone who was very important once upon a time, who stressed the ethical and spiritual dimensions of democracy. Gandhi corresponded with Tolstoy, who called him his spiritual heir. So, in other words, a near perfect embodiment of the open cosmopolitan mind, the perfect citizen of the world. We can definitely fault him for having some of the racial and caste and gender prejudices of his time. We can fault him for his political misjudgments and his faddishness. But even his harshest critics cannot deny, and do not deny, in fact, that he steadfastly defended and eventually sacrificed his life for many values under worldwide assault today, whether it's fellow feeling for the weak, solidarity and sympathy between people of different nations, ethnicities, religions, and races. Moreover, I think he has much to say about the issues that make our present moment so volatile, whether it's inequality or resentment, the rise of demagogues, and the breakdown of democratic governance. Also, he had a whole repertoire of social protest, and when you see boycotts or strikes or collective vigils and these other modes of protest, these were, many of these were pioneered by Gandhi and deployed with world historical results. And obviously, people who are fighting for the environment, for the rights of women, ethnic and sexual minorities, or for the rights of refugees and immigrants, they continue to be inspired by satyagrahas. So in many ways, he kind of anticipated our arrival in this present moment, this sort of very baffling impasse we inhabit, the impasse of the main innovations of the modern era, from democracy to economic growth and technological innovation. And I think it's really important to remember that he was never really much enamored by what he called nominal Western democracies. He thought these democracies are simply better at concealing their foundations of violence and exploitation, much better than explicitly fascist nations were. He actually thought that democracy is an impossibility as long as the wide gulf between the rich and the poor exists, and as long as legislators act like a prostitute, that was his very notorious term for the British Parliament, as long as voters take their direction from newspapers, which are often dishonest. So these were critiques being offered in the 1920s and 30s, which feel very relevant today. Also, you would say that people try to imagine that they have a voice in their own government. Instead, they are being exploited by the ruling class or caste under the sacred name of democracy. And I think he also said that a regime in which the rich flourish and the weakest go to the wall fundamentally cannot be sustained except by violence. It's either concealed violence or open violence. And he predicted that even the states that are nominally democratic today are likely to become frankly totalitarian. And also, this critique of the West went with lack of faith in the so-called catch-up efforts of the non-Western countries. He calculated very early on that the environmental costs of this catch-up, of industrial progress or mass consumption, would be catastrophic. I think in 1928 he wrote, I quote, "If an entire nation of 300 millions, which was India's population at the time, took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. India," he said, "would be a curse for other nations, a menace to the world once it became industrialized." So I think for these reasons, and there were others, he said it was not enough to demand, like socialists do, left-leaning people do, demand liberation from capitalist exploitation and degradation. He argued that we have to achieve an outlook in which the multiplicity of material wants will not be the aim of life. In fact, his whole critique of modern civilization hinged on what he saw as the refusal to recognize limits. He experienced his civilization, which was shaped by human will and ambition, and really gloried in this idea of unappeasable human will and ambition, like Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars and colonize it. To this kind of civilization, he counterposed a civilization that was organized around self-limitation and ethical conduct. "We shall cease to think," he wrote, "of getting what we can, but we shall decline to receive what all cannot get. The only real dignified human doctrine is the greatest good of all." I'm quoting this at some length because they seem more valid today when they were first expressed. The evidence mounts daily in our lives of political cultures degenerating into an amoral social Darwinism. Too many people have come to fear that the material interests of their nation, of their race, of their class will not survive unless and until ruthless measures are taken against their enemies. It's a kind of inferno of existential terrors and fantasies of violence that cruelty, brutality received a kind of unprecedented sanction in the 30s. And today it seems, more and more that we are in the midst today, when you hear of massacres or demagogues flourishing, that we are in the midst of, this is something the social anthropologist Arjun Appadurai wrote some years ago, that we're in the midst of some sort of a vast worldwide Malthusian correction, which is preparing the world for a tiny minority, the winners of globalization, minus the inconvenient noise of the losers of globalization. The other thing is, we also face a crisis of environmental sustainability. And so feel more urgently than people in Gandhi's own time the need to find alternative conceptions of human selfhood and agency. And perhaps, what Gandhi called duty of citizenship of the world becomes clearer if we agree that the physical salvation of the world is the transcendent goal of our times, a duty and an obligation. So if we, the idea of transcendence is taken mostly a religious form, a spiritual form, but if we can reconceive this in the light of our global emergency, keep it linked, that idea linked to religious and spiritual commitments and the values of selflessness and compassion. It's not just sort of, me saying that. There is evidence in recent decades where people have tried to do this with ideas and movements, with deep ecology, Buddhist economics, ecofeminism, animal ethics, Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical, the green political parties. They've all helped outline a vision of environmental sustainability as a transcendent ideal. And I think in this regard, we have much to learn from environmental movements in India, for instance, the work of some very influential campaigners, thinkers like Arundhati Roy, Medha Patkar, Vandana Shiva. There have been Buddhist monk movements for the environment in Thailand and Southeast Asia. Many other inspired movements, non-governmental organizations. And in many of these places, local religions, local folk traditions have provided sanction for the protection of natural resources. A whole set of ideas and values drawn from both folk and mainstream religions actually have been really crucial to the work of many environmental movements since the 1980s. You might have heard of the Chipko conservation movement in India, and the word actually means to cling to, and demonstrators clung to trees in order to impede loggers. There were forest monks in Cambodia and Thailand who kind of sacralized trees by wrapping them in saffron robes. There's a famous instance in the Philippines where the Catholic Mass was performed as people blocked a logging operation. I personally witnessed in places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and even in the Yunnan province in officially communist China, Buddhism and Taoism and some folk traditions are mobilized to promote environmental causes. How many middle classes come to vegetarianism and recycling and reduce consumption through some of these local religious traditions. So these trends, I think, in these parts of Asia really do offer us much scope to refine our understanding of what progressive thought or cosmopolitanism might mean in a context where the ideologies of endless progress and endless consumption seem to be pushing us all into a dystopian future. Certainly, this is, I would argue, is also what the political moral traditions of the so-called Global South have to teach us. More ethical modes of conceiving the self and its interdependent relationship with others and to the natural world. The possibility that there is still some way to escape this gigantic iron cage of modernity. I try to use this phrase from Max Weber carefully, and I hope not inaccurately, because I think the modernity that we associate, with the 200 years since the Enlightenment, came with the promise of a more equal, a more just, a materially improved future. And there was also the potential of using science and reason to achieve this future. This modernity offered secular ideology of history and progress as a kind of replacement for older religious goals of transcendence. And I think it, obviously the fundamental promise of this modernity, equality, justice, freedom, these are now global values. They are in fact a kind of revolutionary force, which you can see in every major mobilization today. You can see it in the Middle East. You can see this in the rise of China. But it's also true, as is many of the people that I mentioned warned, that a very purely material and scientific worldview has helped desacralize nature. This sort of particular worldview of rationality, of the rational enlightenment, has accustomed us to see the world as a place that does not really make any kind of moral or normative demands on us. And it's also becoming harder and harder to deny that, in many ways we are kind of living in the ruins of these modern ideologies, which now seem to have escaped all human control and seem to be possessed of a kind of irrational momentum all there on. Let me end with a quotation. States grow ever more machine-like. Men are transformed into statistical choruses of voters, producers, patients, tourists, or soldiers. In politics, good and evil, categories of the natural world, lose all absolute meaning. The sole method of politics is quantifiable success. Power is a priori innocent because it does not grow from a world in which words like guilt and innocence retain their meaning. This could be Gandhi or any of the thinkers I just mentioned. It's actually Václav Havel, in a very early, brilliant essay of his, Politics and Conscience, where he's actually describing the political consequences of the desacralized world, a kind of loss of the human scale, not just in the communist countries, but also in Western democracies. And he wrote that actually we need a genuine, profound, and lasting change for the better. But it cannot result from the victory of either communism or capitalism. It would have to derive from really fundamental reconstitution of the position of people in the world, their relationships to themselves and to each other and to the universe. Now, this sounds like a completely utopian wish, but I believe this vision of the future is given plausibility by the moral idealism of the young today, their cultures of ethical responsibility, no matter how much they might annoy their elders, their hopes and aspirations for justice and peace beyond the realm of political and economic ideas. I believe too that some of the intellectual and spiritual resources for this new will to transcendence exist, and they can be found in what we too narrowly describe as the Global South. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Pankaj. You've given us a lot of food for thought in your wide-ranging reflections. And I want to remind folks that we're going to chat up here for a few minutes, but I want to leave at least 15 or maybe even 20 minutes for your questions. If you have questions, please write them down on the cards and pass them to the outer aisles, and they'll be fed to me, and we can get through as many as possible. So Pankaj, you ended on a hopeful note, and we may want to come back to that, the spiritual and cultural resources at our disposal, and the potential for young people to take the lead in forging a new world. And since we're at a university and we have students here, that might be something that comes up as well in the discussion. But I think it makes sense to start out perhaps with a question about this concept of the Global South, which I think you're rightly skeptical of, the use and the misuse of it in political commentary. It's become a term of art, it's very fashionable, and of course it elides a lot of differences across countries and cultures. It totalizes. And yet, I think you're making the case that it is useful in some sense as demarcating a kind of a cultural and political space, those parts of the world impacted, being on the receiving end of colonialism and imperialism, and shaped by that experience in ways that make them really suited in creative ways to contribute to this wider global conversation. So how would you respond to the critique that even in this wider cultural sense, there's a danger of eliding a lot of the differences with an overarching term like Global South?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think when you think about it in the ways that the word has been used in recent months, actually, not even years at this point, I think the attempt has been to obscure the differences, different histories, different trajectories within the Global South, and to, I mean, essentially to enlist these countries in the sort of new Cold War against Russia and China. And I think with that aim in mind, the suppression of contradictions or sort of anything that hints at disharmony is going to be neglected or suppressed. But I think if you look at the, for want of a better word, the counter-cultural tradition within the Global South, I think what's really interesting are the similarities and shared experiences to the extent that, you know, there is other, I didn't speak of it today, but obviously there's been a large, long, collaborative tradition of people from different parts of Asia and Africa working together, thinking together, sharing ideas, meeting, and this started, you know, from the late 19th century onwards. And what was that common experience? I think it was that experience really of being forced to confront some very powerful and to them extremely alien modes of thought, different ways of organizing society, of creating political institutions. So from the experience of shock and bewilderment, then diagnosing, you know, just exactly what are we up against, what should we do to confront this, that over about 5 or 6 decades really created a very important intellectual archive. And then, of course, I think the other thing then that binds them is what I call the experience of wanting to catch up, and then finding that actually you don't really have the material you need in order to really properly catch up. Some countries do, you know, they did catch up, Japan to a certain extent, or you could argue South Korea. Smaller countries with ethnically homogeneous populations. But in many other places where nation states were artificial constructs, there were huge problems, and, you know, countries, societies spent a lot of their energy simply kind of trying to resolve these problems or trying to dissolve those problems through violence. So I think there is, I mean, it could be argued that there are certain experiences which bind these very disparate, otherwise, you know, geographically and politically very disparate countries together.
And if we try to link up the shared experience and this framework you're using, which I agree is very productive, of the Global South with global issues, global challenges more broadly, I think one of the more fascinating insights, most fascinating insights in your talk is this theme of intellectual inequality, which is also, of course, historically constructed. You make the point in your writings, and today you've reiterated the point, that the critique of the sort of modern world system dominated by the West, articulated from within the Global South, goes back quite a ways. It just hasn't been heard. and was never heard. And I guess my question is now, if you're right about the shifting power dynamics in the world, in the rebalancing that's going on, we should be seeing, and perhaps we are seeing, and you could speak to this, examples of a widening conversation where there's more willingness to listen in the United States, in Europe. I'm not going to use the phrase global north, but I guess I just did. A widening readiness to listen to and learn from these voices. Do we see that happening now?
Little bit, definitely.
Yeah,
I mean, I think, when I first started out, it was a pretty bleak situation back in the late 90s. And one has to remember that was also kind of, I suppose, there was a moment of triumphalism. That was the post 1989 end of history moment. So the idea that people in non-Western countries had something to contribute or something to say about this was likely to be greeted with contempt, because I think the assumption, the main assumption there was that we've really solved the riddle of history, and that we've arrived at this stage, and other countries have no choice but to try and imitate us. So from that moment to now, I think it has been really the experience of adversity and finding that the assumptions that you used while framing policy, foreign policy, economic policy, were faulty, were defective. And I think, it's because of this experience of failure and fiasco that, I think I find that there is a slightly more receptive audience. But I think the investments in kind of, intellectual industry are massive and have been massive over the decades. And so it takes a very long time. It's like asking a major ship to turn around, and it takes a while, for that to happen. So it's, the sort of sheer momentum can carry this particular intellectual industry for several years and years and years before it starts to correct. And then also we need, I think we need more scholars, we need more intellectuals from that part of the world to also, introduce us to write about some of these things, and also, to kind of also have more occasions like these. So I think it's beginning to happen. It has been happening over the last decade or so, but the process is still slow.
Good. Let me remind you all to pose questions, write them out on cards. I haven't received any yet. I've got a bunch here, so I can. They aren't transmitted directly to me. They actually have to be physically brought up here. But in the meantime, on this theme of resistance to this new world, you've been living in many different countries. You've even spent extended time in the US, but you're primarily based in London now, but an acute observer of the United States. It strikes me, here we are in Washington, D.C., that part of the psychological adjustment we're talking about for the United States and for US political culture is linked back to the force of what's often called American exceptionalism. And this relates in an interesting way maybe to your reflections on religion and nationalism. The idea, and this is not simply a Christian nationalist idea, it's a very widespread idea that's part of our education in this country, that we have a sort of God-given mission to spread freedom around the world is a very powerful idea. President Obama, for example, got in trouble when he was asked about American exceptionalism. Did he believe in it? And he said, of course I do, just like all those other countries believe in their own exceptionalism. He had to backtrack from that, and he did. And I wonder whether our culture has really moved beyond that. So do you see the United States and our institutions, our political discourse, which I know you also observe, do you see any signs of hope in terms of an ability to open up and listen to and learn from the experience of the rest of the world in the face of these common global challenges?
I think, I feel, Tom, that enormous power of the kind the United States possesses and has possessed now for 7, 8 decades, it does make for a certain kind of intellectual provincialism, and this has always been the case, I think, because if you're on the margins, if you're in feeling oppressed in some ways by the dominant powers of the day, you have to make a really strong effort to learn about the things that are pressing down on you, that sort of explain your marginal position, that also explain the humiliation that you suffer. I think with powerful people in general, they don't really feel the urge to understand the world that they dominate, because they dominate it so easily, and without really, any great exercise of, or at least any great expanded exercise of the intellect. So I think that is the strange situation in which an incredibly powerful country with incredible resources finds itself in, has been in for some time, too locked into particular narratives of its moral and political excellence, unable to see also that those things are also under assault by forces within the country. And I think the default narrative when people like Trump emerge is again the narrative of American exceptionalism. I think the intellectual response to Trump was very disappointing, because all it could do was reaffirm that we are not like this, and that we are better, and this is why we are better. So it doesn't quite open up scope for self-examination, let alone dialogue with the rest of the world. It remains a kind of narcissistic exercise.
Well, we'll see. The presidential campaign is just heating up, and we'll be able to test and see just how global the discourse is. I'm not very optimistic. We do have a lot of questions now, so I have one more question I'd like to pose at the very end, but I'm going to get through as many of these as I can. This one relates to the question of new voices in a broader global debate. What, if anything, has been the impact of social media on new voices, new ideas, and new ideologies from what today we are calling the Global South? Can you comment on India in particular as the world leader of internet shutdowns?
Well, I think when I speak of my ancestral country, especially on the subject of social media, I can really only offer very bad news, because it's not only the world's leader in internet shutdowns, it's also now the capital of global disinformation. So some of the most hideous videos to emerge in the last month or so were actually manufactured in India. There was a newspaper report on this, really shocking report. So I think, on the whole, social media has liberated, allowed many people to feel that they have a voice, and also able to kind of create platforms for marginal positions, which would not otherwise get a hearing in the so-called legacy media. But I think, in certain contexts, and India is one of those contexts, the domination and the manipulation of social media by powerful and rich people has also alerted us to the ways in which social media can be and has been profoundly disruptive of social harmony.
Thanks. And I'm trying to kind of group the questions so we have a little bit of thematic continuity. This also interesting question about intellectual inequality and voices from the Global South. What space does an expansion of the intellectual tradition to the Global South leave for individuals excluded from that tradition, such as people without higher education? How will this expansion continue to involve their voices?
Well, I think, that's why I think someone like Gandhi, and, again, I used him because he's the most famous of the many people I talk about, or am interested in. But people like him, or people who still follow that particular mode of thinking about the world, were not people who believed in a hierarchy of educated people or not very well educated people. In fact, a lot of their efforts were aimed at precisely these hierarchies which exclude, the less educated or the poor. They were meant to be much more inclusive than sort of mainstream modern ideologies. And one reason why he dressed the way he did, he spoke the way he did, the reason for his experiments was to draw those people into politics, into public life.
Another theme that's come up in the questions that you developed in your talk is spiritual resources or religious resources as we attempt to broaden the debate and engage with the ecological and other questions. And here a questioner asks you to say a bit more on the relation of the global quest for transcendence and how it relates to the major world religious traditions.
I think, it remains, again, one tradition, the dominant tradition in Western countries, which is of secularism, which is involved certainly in a sort of suspicion of religion and politics in general, and suspicion of the religious impulse, broadly amounting to, I think, delegitimization of religion as a kind of resource in tackling problems of the kind we face today, the environment being one of them. But I think, again, we forget that large parts of the countries we call the Global South, this tradition either does not exist or is extremely weak, and that most people still conceive of transcendence as, an actual goal, that they've never really stopped thinking or stopped believing in that. So again, it's that thing like we imagine, because we dress in a certain way, we go to university, we go to a job in an office, and we think of ourselves as secularized folks, and we think a lot of people, other people also must be like that. But I see so many people living around me in India who are very much committed to the idea of transcendence. They've never stopped thinking about it. So those spiritual resources, those traditions, obviously they've been altered beyond recognition by the impress of the modern world. But they still exist. People still have these religious and spiritual commitments. So they remain a kind of ready resource for facing these kind of political and environmental challenges.
I wonder if you could relate that connection between these spiritual and cultural traditions and ecology, which you touched on in your talk, to other global concerns. Is there a link between these traditions, say in the case of India, and a global horizon, a cosmopolitan viewpoint, a solidarity with strangers, a kind of global frame? Do you see resources there as well?
Yeah, and I think, again, what sort of could possibly bind these various geographical spaces in one common experience? I mean, I think it is thinking of the earth as an deeply endangered place, and the preservation of what we have as a main task facing all of us. So if it's a community of indigenous people in India, and this actually happened. They were given huge sums of money to vacate their sacred forests and the sacred mountain, which by mining companies, and they said no, and then they were forced out, some of them, and they went to a court. They filed a court case, fought for years and years, and finally won. And they said, look, we don't want to do this because this is sacred to us. So I think this notion that what we have in terms of natural resources is something sacred is a very powerful idea. You don't really have to be religious or be a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist in order to take that on board or to believe in that.
And this is a question that relates to the theme of religion. Interesting question here. You offer ideas from the Global South, mainly arising from religions, as pointing to another way aimed at compassion, cosmopolitanism, and moral transformation. How is this different from the old canards about Eastern religions built on a spiritual life being superior to the materialist West? Is this different from positively inflected Orientalism?
Yeah, there's always a danger, I think in these kinds of discussions of religion that they will be seen as part of a longer and older discourse of Eastern spirituality or Eastern religiosity, or look at the beautiful people of India. But I think I hope we have moved past those kinds of stereotypes. We've also moved past a certain kind of personalization of Eastern religion of the kind we saw in the 60s and 70s when people embraced, Buddhism or transformed Buddhism and Hinduism into New Age modes of religiosity and spirituality. And essentially, you can see this even today, like Madonna embracing yoga. This is all for, her personal uplift or her sort of self-care, as it were. It has very little to do with any kind of larger social, political, or environmental question. And so those kinds of appropriations have happened a lot in the 60s and 70s, continue to happen. But these are very large, capacious traditions, so you can always find what you want in them. And there are also multiple ways of describing them. But I think, if your strategy is to use what is important, what is relevant in those particular traditions, and enlist them into larger causes, or sort of see them as addressing certain needs, I think that's also legitimate.
And related to that, this question notes, quote, many of the examples of hopeful contributions that you mentioned, forest monks, even Gandhi, seem somewhat radical and exceptional. Are there more mainstream examples you would give for the rest of us?
I suspect that we all need to be a little bit radical at this point, The mainstream has got us in a very strange place. Time to move away from it, It's like, it's really populated by some very unpleasant figures and ideas at this point. So radicalism is very much the need of the hour,
All right. So I want to circle back to that as we look forward and think about young people and universities in particular. But first, let's take a detour back to geopolitics. A couple of the questions here. This is from Claudia Dichego, who's a visiting fellow at the Berkeley Center. You had a chance to meet earlier. Is the tension between the global North and the global South policymakers a new Cold War? And related, will the new global North be willing to accept a new global order where they share power with the global South equally? So the question of international institutions, which hasn't come up yet. Yeah.
I think it's a very important question. I think the fate of the world really hinges on whether the institutions and leaders of the global North are willing to acknowledge sharing, or willing to share some of their power with some of these other countries and their respective intellectual cultures. Because I think what we've seen so far is mostly a posture of confrontation or containment, driven by the notion that perhaps there is still time, there is still a way to arrest this process of unipolarity, or there is still time to maintain our global hegemony. The other day, President Biden saying we are the most powerful country in the world, we are the indispensable nation. These words fall on deaf ears in large parts of the global South. In fact, they irritate quite a lot of people. And I feel that, certainly the refusal to accommodate the aspirations of some of these, not all of them are legitimate aspirations, but nevertheless, simply acknowledging that these countries have particular historical worldviews derived from the experiences of the last 150 years, that they will not be pushed around, they'll not be humiliated in the way their ancestors were, and that there is a different, even changing the tone, changing the way in which you speak to them or you speak about them. I mean, even these kinds of things have become really important. It's not just sharing institutional power, but like how do you address, how do you talk about these countries? Because as I said, humiliation is a really important factor in the mental and emotional makeup of many of these people in these countries. And I think anything that sort of anything that is perceived as further humiliation is just makes things worse.
And you pointed out just now and in your talk, tell me if you agree, but it's a kind of double historical humiliation. There's the experience of colonialism, but then there's the failed effort to catch up. And it's those two, one on top of the other, that's generated such an explosive situation.
It does. Yeah. And I think for many regimes, the fact that you're failing to catch up and that the fact that a lot of your citizens are therefore frustrated and angry with you for having failed to, kind of bring their societies to that convergence with the West, means that you actually use a kind of anti-Western nationalism as providing as a kind of foundational narrative for yourself. Like, we are here because we're standing up to the West. We are telling them what we think of them, and that then becomes a very potent narrative amongst angry, frustrated, and humiliated peoples. So there is also that danger in addition to all those others.
All right, well, we've come up almost against our time, but I want to come back to a theme that's addressed here in the questions and that you mentioned at the end of your talk, the hopeful look to the future and to youth in particular. This particular question, I'll embed it within a larger reflection, is could you give us more examples of Global South youth mobilization, for example, in the area of ecological activism? And I would just add to that, in general, what gives you hope? One could argue that there's a lot of desperation among young people around the world, but you're focusing on the positive. So could you give some examples of positive activism, but also ground your sense of hope, and also perhaps related to the mission of a university like Georgetown?
I think the examples that I have in mind really are very much connected to the state that I've spent a lot of my adult life in India, where I've seen really extraordinary levels of energy and commitment from young environmental activists, also from actually people in journalism who are very concerned about the sort of depredations of particularly developers in that state. As you probably know, it's a largely mountainous state, very, very high up and sort of really under right now facing a kind of slow calamity. So I think there's been a lot of mobilization there, and especially amongst young people. And of course, you read about things that young people are engaged in other parts of India, and indeed other parts of Asia. Also in China, I've kind of personally met people, some of the people who are engaged with this. And I think, again, to answer the related question, it is because that they are being forced, like the people I spoke of in my talk, the people in Asia and Africa who were forced to confront these dominant powers and to assess them and to see the problems very, very clearly. And I think the young people today find themselves in a similar situation. My generation did not do this because there was no imperative, there was no obligation to really look at these things. We were all assured, kind of membership of the modern world through the same old route, university, a professional career, and so on. We weren't really confronted with existential challenges to the world, and which is what the young in most countries around the world are facing. And that makes for a certain degree of intellectual agility, and also, I think what's very important and almost essential is hope. We cannot really go forward without this essential ingredient and the hope to at least address some of the damage. So I think, I feel like, yes, this is a moment where young people are really confronting simultaneously a political crisis, an environmental crisis, and they are being educated by this. It's a very harsh education, unfortunately, but the harsh education is also making them more energetic and intellectually more resourceful.
Well, thank you. It is great to end on a hopeful note, looking forward. We're really very grateful for the time you spent with us this afternoon, for your insights. And one thing I take away from your talk is that the necessity and the possibilities for this more global, inclusive conversation about our shared future are becoming more apparent to more people. So we have every reason to hope there as well. So please join me in thanking Pak Ho Shin Chun.